Willkommen in einem anderen Afrikaans video, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 5 of my pre-stags or pre-17th century warfare series of videos. In this case, a second example game of Cannae using a hexless version of the SPI pre-stags rules, which I happen to call pre-17th century warfare. Now, the original Pre-Stag is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a hexless version of these rules designed for figures. This video will not go into any detail of the game system. If you wish to understand what is occurring in more detail, you can download the Pre-Stag's rules from the URL in the description, or view part 1 of my example series, which goes into more detail concerning the rules. If we go back to the original SPI board game, Pre-Stag means a pre-17th century tactical game system. The game system took a number of earlier games designed by SPI called Armageddon, Phalanx, Centurion, Dark Ages and Renaissance of Infantry, and standardised all the games so they use the same basic game system. This allowed players to pit an ancient Egyptian force against Gustav Adolphus, for example. This example again uses a scenario from the Spartan set of scenarios, which is the Cannae scenario. I've created a PDF document with all of the pre-stag scenarios. This shows the 2 printable pages which describes the Cannae scenario. The map on the right is my template for players to create the playing area using my hexless version of the rules. However, I'm not really very happy with the playing area. While I'll be using the original scenario from the pre-stag set of rules, including the original force mix, I'll be using a new playing area based on this map that you can see here. This comes from History Marche channel on YouTube, and I think it's probably more accurate than the original playing area from the SPI board game. This shows the initial deployment with a river on the Carthaginian left wing and the hills on its right wings. A few points about the scenario. In the original rules, the open terrain is about 10 hexes wide, which translates into 2 kilometres, which is the supposed width of the battlefield. This playing area is wider, being closer to 3 kilometres, just under 3 kilometres. Basically, the game mechanics do not seem to support the troop densities which actually occurred, or at least that's what I assumed at the beginning. As I discovered after playing this game, I suspect you can actually increase the density quite easily, and there is actually a reason in order to do so. But anyway, it is what it is. Another comment I wish to make: while the Carthaginian force mix is reasonably correct, representing about 50,000 men, the Roman side is not, as it represents only about 56,000 men, which is far too low. The pre-stag game system does not support the concept of raw blade units, so I assume the scenario varies the scale to allow the Romans to feel the same troop quality. This is a general issue with pre-stags. The troop types are very limited, and any issues are resolved by varying the troop scale. This works, but it doesn't give you the correct feel of the battle. For my next project, I'm planning on adopting a conversion of the DBMM troop types for this game system, which will allow the Romans to feel large numbers of raw Legionnaires. I'm not going to deal with any of these issues here. I'm simply using the standard scenario with the standard troop types, with the only change being the hexless system. But nonetheless, I think in the long term, I would be better off converting all these scenarios into something that used DBMM troop types, simply because the DBMM troop types gives me the sufficient level of differentiation between different troop types, which I think you need in order to get the correct feel for a game. Now, if we use a DBMM troop types and a consistent troop scale, one question you may need to ask yourself is, how do we actually fit all these extra troops into the same size battlefield? You've already heard me mention that I had difficulty fitting the existing troops into the existing battlefield as per a historical 2 kilometre width, and I had to increase it accordingly. Now, in this case, as you can see here, the Romans are effectively 12 ranks deep. So that's 3 elements. Each element is 4 ranks deep. To allow for higher troop densities, unit sizes would need to increase, which is definitely possible in the game system, although you may end up with rather deep units. A lot of thought needs to go into this to ensure you don't get any abuse, but I can quite easily see it very viable to have raw Legionnaires, possibly 6 elements deep, thus giving you a more accurate feel of the way the battle actually occurred, or the force mix of the Romans in the battle anyway. Let's look at the pre-stag force mix. This shows the Roman deployment and force mix. The Romans have 8 militia spearmen, which I assume is the hastati, 9 barbarian infantry, which I assume is the allied Italian forces in a traditional structure, possibly Samnite mountain troops. 20 swordsmen, which are the Legionnaires, fort-like cavalry, which are the Roman and allied cavalry, 4 skirmishers, which I suppose are velites or levies, 1 leader 2, which is probably Paulus, and 1 leader 3, which is Varro. Let's now move to the Carthaginian deployment and force mix. The Carthaginians have 12 militia spearmen, which I assume are the Libyan infantry, 6 light infantry, which I assume are the Spanish, 6 barbarian infantry, which I assume are the Gallic, 2 light cavalry, which I assume are Spanish cavalry, 4 medium cavalry, which I assume are Gallic cavalry and possibly phony Libyan cavalry, 6 skirmishers, which are javelmen from a host of nationalities, and 4 oriental cavalry, which I assume are the Numidian cavalry. There is a leader 1, which is clearly Hannibal, and a leader 2, which is, I suppose, Hasdrubal. Both sides can stack 3 element units. Let's now drill down into the deployment in more detail. This shows the Roman deployment, the deployment that I put together anyway. I have the Roman militia spearmen at the rear, because I assume that represents the Hastati, and the Hastati were in the third line historically. I have no particular reason beyond this to deploy them in this particular manner. The next troop type are the Roman Swordsmen or Legionnaires, and they're deployed in the centre at the front that you can see here. This shows where I have the Roman barbarian infantry, which I have to assume are Roman allies formed up in their traditional structure, as I indicated before, perhaps Samnites which were used to fighting in rough terrain. You may ask, why do I have a unit in the rear? This is due to the deployment rules, which limits the Romans' deployment to within 5 base widths of the central point on the Roman line. I don't know why the Romans have been restricted in this manner, but because of leader command radiuses, keeping the line as short as possible is probably wise. In the original game, if the Romans create a very long line, the Carthaginians would retreat, and the Romans, at half move rate, would take a while to move forward. As the Romans need to take an objective by game turn 20, wasting time is probably not wise. Now I've placed the Roman skirmishers on each flank, as you can see here. In my original deployment, I had each skirmisher merged in with a Roman cavalry. And the reason why I did this is because I read some historical references which indicated that the Romans on at least one flank did mix infantry in with their cavalry, which caused the Carthaginians some problems. As it turned out, it didn't get deployed in the way I originally thought because the line was simply not long enough. I mean, the available terrain was not long enough to deploy my line as long as I originally thought. Finally, we have the Roman cavalry, which is considered as light cavalry in these rules. Again, if we use a DBMM, they would be a medium cavalry, but they would be probably of some lower quality or something of that nature. Now we come to the commanders or leaders. The Romans have a leader 2, which is on the left, and a leader 3 on the right. The Roman extreme left flank, as a result, is out of command control and can only move at half its normal movement rate. This is why having a line any wider than this becomes quite difficult as the Roman, because, well, unless of course you intend to crawl forward at a fairly low movement rate. Now we come to the deployment of my opponent, the Carthaginians, as you can see here. The Libyan militia are deployed on either flank simply because that's where we think they were historically deployed. The Spanish light infantry are then positioned next to the Libyans simply because that's where we think they were positioned. And finally, in the centre we have our Gallic infantry. In retrospect, it probably would have been better off mixing the Gauls with the Libyan, with the Spanish, as that sort of evened out the combat strength. But anyway, it isn't a major issue, but that's probably what I would do in future if I played the Carthaginians. And finally, we have the skirmishers in the front rank of the centre of the line. And even though skirmishers aren't particularly great melee forces, within the game system, their position here is actually quite significant and is a key factor in the Carthaginians doing as well as they did historically, or as well as they did in this game. We have deployed the Numidians on the right flank of the Carthaginians, simply because that's where we think they were historically deployed. The Gallic cavalry, and probably also the Libyan Phoenician cavalry, are deployed on the left flank. Again, that's where we think they were historically deployed. Now we come to light cavalry, which is what I assume is the Spanish cavalry, and that's been placed on the left flank. Now, my opponent organised the cavalry on the left flank in the same way that I did in earlier games, which basically had 2 medium cavalry and 1 light cavalry per unit, 2 separate units. Finally, we deploy the leaders. The Carthaginians have a leader 1, which is Hannibal, and a leader 2, which I assume is Hasdrubal, both of which have a command radius of 2 base widths each. As a result, all the Carthaginian units are in command control in this case. Incidentally, the Carthaginians don't need to concern themselves with command control for the cavalry. The cavalry do not need any commanders in order to move at its full rate. So Carthaginians could actually even extend its line if it so desire and have the cavalry flying off even further on the flanks. Now, as it turns out, there's not enough room on the playing area to allow this to occur, so, it does have a benefit for the Carthaginians, but not a particularly great one in this battle. Now we're going to start the game, starting with game turn 1, and the Carthaginians being the first player. The first player is a Carthaginian player, and during the Carthaginian player turn, the Carthaginians do nothing. The Carthaginians do not wish to be contacted by the Romans and have all the time in the world according to the victory conditions, thus decide to just stay where they are. During game turn 1, during the Roman player turn, the Romans simply form up their line, as you can see here. Now, the width of the battlefield was about 14 base widths, which make it impossible to form up the cavalry on each flank correctly without moving onto the hills on the left. The main issue I now have is large parts of my left flank are no longer in command control, thus can only move at a half movement rate. Now we move on to game turn 2. During the Carthaginian player turn, the Carthaginians once again do nothing for the same reason I indicated before. Carthaginians' main objective is to simply stop the Romans from getting to its objective, and they know the Romans will eventually have to contact them, thus they'll be able to hopefully achieve a marginal victory by eliminating more Romans and Carthaginians. So they don't really need to do anything, and that's exactly what they do. During the Roman player turn, the Romans move forward. Now, the barbarian infantry on the left flank can only move 3 base widths or 12 centimetres because it's outside of command control. Thus, the Romans decide to move just outside of 12 centimetres from the Carthaginians, and the main reason why they picked 12 centimetres is to ensure that they don't get contacted by the Libyan spearmen. It's not a big issue, but why bother getting contacted by more enemy than I otherwise need to, because the Carthaginians next game turn are certainly going to be charging into contact. We now move to game turn 3, and the Carthaginians finally move. Now, I must admit, I originally thought the Carthaginians would retreat to outside of a Roman contact range, as I thought that they would try and delay the melee as long as possible, but that did not occur. Now, the Carthaginians, during the Carthaginian player turn, there are no fire troops in range, so there's no fire combat during the first fire combat phase. Thus, we move on to the Carthaginians' movement phase. Because the distance between both lines were about 14 centimetres, the Libyan spearmen are unable to contact the Romans. That's why I kept the gap to a distance beyond the movement allowance of the Libyan foot, which happens to be 12 centimetres. The Medians on the right flank moved just outside of missile range of the Roman skirmishers. The Carthaginians move the commanders around, moving the commander on the left to one of the cavalry units to give it more punch. Now, because the Carthaginian cavalry moved into fire range of the skirmishers, the Romans conduct a defensive fire against the cavalry. This occurs basically after all Carthaginian movement has been completed, and the opposing player can then decide to conduct defensive fire. So, I've got 2 skirmishers, which is an attack of 4 against 3. Remember, I'm attacking the ground, not the unit. And I spin a 5, which means it's a disruption, which is actually an extraordinarily good result for the Romans. I discovered a new rule at this point, or at least my opponent did. The Carthaginian commander in this image is not actually in the correct position. It's supposed to be with one of the cavalry units, the cavalry unit that's not disrupted. So, based on this, I asked him why he did not fire against the cavalry with the commander, because I would have thought disrupting that would have a bigger impact. Apparently, if you go through the rules, if a unit has a commander, any disruption result from fire combat is ignored, and so I discovered an interesting new tactic. The rules may be simple, but I'm still learning new rules which I missed in my initial 10 readings of the rule books. Now we move into the Carthaginian Melee phase. The Carthaginians attack with 7 plus 6 for the commander against 3 and spin a 6. The defenders are eliminated, a great result. Note that the cavalry unit's attacking out of its corner against the Roman skirmishers and light cavalry. In the next melee, the Carthaginians attack with 3 of their units against 1 Roman unit. That's 34 versus 11. They spin a 5. The result is half eliminated, which again is a pretty good result for the Carthaginians. We now do another attack, this time 38 against 17. Note the Roman has the cavalry commander, or the commander with it, which adds 6 to it. The Carthaginians spin a 6 and the result is disruption. Now I discovered another rule, once again my opponent discovered this, and this is why he attacked in this manner. When a leader is with a unit, then all disruptions are ignored, which you'd think is a good for me having a leader there. However, what occurs instead is the leader drops 1 level. In my case, my L3 leader dropped to L4. That was my opponent's objective, to try and start knocking down my commanders to reduce my ability to move. Okay, you may be asking at this point, why are units attacking out of their corners? When I converted these rules into a hexless format, my objective was to make no changes and attempt to reproduce the rules as closely as possible, only removing the hexes. Using a hex grid, if you move across 1 grain, you can actually attack with 3 units against 1. And if you attack along the other grain, you can only attack with 2 units against 1. To simulate this, I basically stated any base-to-base contact, even a corner, allows you to conduct melee against that unit. Now in this case, the Carthaginian player decided to line up the elements perfectly, so you had 3-1 attack options. If the Carthaginians had, slightly offset their units, then basically the most you could attack a unit is with 2 other units. In summary, the players decide if the grain allows for a 3-1 or 2-1 attacks. Personally, I'm not happy with this, but it's the way the original rules work, and I'm not going to change it. And I suspect if I did try and do any modifications, it would have some unforeseen results at the other end. I know these rules basically do work. I don't want to play around with them to make them fail. This shows the position at the end of the Carthaginian Melee phase. Now we move into the Roman Platoon. The Roman decides to attack the disrupted Carthaginian cavalry unit. They are attacking this unit because the second disruption will result in its elimination and the cavalry cannot run away. The Romans attack with 18 versus 5, spin a 3. The result is a second disruption and the Carthaginian cavalry is eliminated. This is a very good result for the Romans. In the next attack, they're attacking the cavalry with the Legionnaires, as you see here. However, because the cavalry are not in contact, that is, they haven't actually engaged in any melee, so they're not engaged in anything, they have a movement allowance which is 3 or greater than the barbarian infantry, they can retreat from combat, and the Carthaginians decide to do that. The Romans decide not to follow up in this case. In the next attack, the Romans attack with 27 versus 5 and spin a 3. The result is disrupted. In this case, the Romans attack with 33 plus 3 for the leader. Note, the leader was L2, but now is L3, so as a result, it only has 3 combat bonuses. Anyway, they spin a 2, the result is disruption. For the next attack, the Romans attack with 22 against 5, spin a 3, and it's another disruption. The Romans finish up with attacking with 36 against 9, and spin a 3, another disruption. The Romans managed to inflict a lot of disruption, but very few actual casualties. Now we move on to game turn 4. Incidentally, in my previous full test game, which used hexes, the Carthaginians, which is the side I was playing, allowed the Romans to contact me, and I considered that as an error. So as a result, in this particular game, my opponent's making sure that the Carthaginians are not the contactee, They're the contacteurs. Let's see what the effect will be. So we start with the Carthaginian player term, and they conduct fire combat first. In this case, it's a 4 versus 3. That's an Numidian cavalry against the Roman barbarian infantry, which I assume is allies in their traditional format. They spin a 6. It's a disruption. In the next fire combat, the Carthaginians attack with 4 against 3, spin a 5, but unfortunately for them, because there is a commander, the disruption is ignored. I don't know why I did this. This was actually when we discovered this rule, and I went back and retrospectively fixed the earlier occurrence of it. But anyway, something. Look, the important thing here is no matter how simple a set of rules are, you will always forget a rule here and there. Luckily in this game we didn't really make too many errors because at least my opponent had some more experience than previously, so there were 2 minds working at it. But something to note with any set of rules, which is really why I particularly like simple rules, because you can get to a point of playing the games properly far quicker if the rules are simpler. Okay, for the next attack, I'm spinning 6 versus 3. I spin a 3. The element is disrupted again. Now, it was disrupted from the previous game turn melee, but then it recovered. Now it's disrupted again. Now, during the Carthaginian movement phase, the Carthaginian cavalry now moves into contact with the Roman barbarian infantry, attacking with 22 versus 9, spin a 3. They've disrupted the Roman barbarian infantry. I think it would have been better if the cavalry went after the remaining Roman cavalry element. At least that's what I think at this point. But anyway, my opponent did what he did. One thing I notice is that in these rules, cavalry really don't do very well against close order infantry, which I suspect is probably very historically accurate. The only reason why they did moderately well is because they were being supported by the Libyan close order infantry next to it. For the next Carthaginian attack, it's 9 versus 11. They spin a 1. There's no result. You may ask why they attacked in this particular manner. Well, there's nothing else really to attack, and why not go for a 1 in 6 chance of causing a disruption? The Carthaginians now attack with 24 versus 4, spin a 1. It's disrupted a second time, and the final Roman legionary element is eliminated. For the next attack, the Carthaginians attack with 28 versus 11, spin a 6. It's disrupted, which is its second disruption. The unit is eliminated. Another good move by the Carthaginians. This shows a position at the end of game turn 4, and it's unusual to say the least. The Roman centre is badly damaged, and while the flanks are holding, this is certainly not historical. I'm beginning to wonder if the game system encourages players to have reserves, which could be used to plug gaps. Perhaps I should have put more infantry in the rear of the centre in order to plug those gaps and continue moving forward. Anyway, it's interesting. Another thing that I find very interesting is the way missile troops work here. On the surface, they look like they're not very effective troops, but if used correctly, they're incredibly effective, as we can see here. I mean, in one case here, the reason why the Roman legionary unit was eliminated is because that was disrupted first with missile fire, and then it was disrupted with melee. We now move into game turn 5. I'm getting the impression the Roman position is not looking very good at this moment, but I still have hope. Now, I'm not going to go through the game turn in a great deal of detail as I did the previous game turn. I think we all probably can work out how the game system works. So what I'm going to be doing is just showing you the position at the end of each game turn. This shows the position at the end of game turn 5. The main change which occurred here was the Carthaginian left, or at the Carthaginian left, where the cavalry managed to eliminate the Roman cavalry and managed to advance after combat to get out of melee contact with the Roman barbarian infantry. We now move into game turn 6. I was a bit distressed in game turn 4, losing so much in the centre, but it seems like game turn 5 is stable, so possibly the Romans aren't as badly off as I originally thought. In all my previous test games, the Romans easily romped to victory in pretty much all the time, so I would be quite disappointed if I failed in this particular case. Well, so much for my hope. At the end of game turn 6, the Roman centre had almost totally broken down. I really found this very strange. It makes me think to reproduce the Roman centre depth, you almost certainly need 2 lines of units, or at least a couple of units of reserves in the bank, possibly the barbarian infantry. Yet on the other hand, this game system does encourage you to get every single bit of combat capacity into the front line to get your odds up as possible. So I'm not quite sure. There's clearly some sort of balance here that you need to achieve. We now go into game turn 7, and I'm depressed again. The situation seems to me to be collapsing for the poor old Romans. Well, this shows the position at the end of game turn 7. The main thing here is the remaining unit or element has been eliminated. There is a major hole in the centre, which is quite significant because you'll notice that there is a Carthaginian unit that has no enemy units in base-to-base combat. That unit is now available to move somewhere and hit my Roman front line in a new position, which is a bit annoying. You may ask, why hasn't the elements in corner position moved out of melee and then hit something in the flank or something of that nature? And the reason is that once you engage, the reason is there's no point. When you engage in melee, you can't actually disengage unless you disrupt or eliminate the enemy. Well, now, that situation has occurred, but the Carthaginian player quite correctly assessed that there's no point to disengage and then come in again at a flank because there's no real advantage doing so, so that's why it remains. But when there is a free unit, the situation is a little bit more significant, as we'll soon discover. So we now move into game turn 8. Now, as the Roman player, I really was tempted to resign at this point, but I decided to keep on playing to see what actually would occur. This shows the position at the end of game turn 8, and actually the Romans start to break down the Carthaginian left flank, with the Libyan unit destroyed or eliminated. In the centre, the Carthaginians have hit the Roman right in the flank. I would have gone with the opposite flank, but perhaps the collapse of the Carthaginian left flank has prompted this decision. It's difficult to say. We now move into game turn 9. This is one of the longest scenarios, and I'm now realising, if played correctly, it's a long, drawn-out slog. Anyway, as the Roman player, I have new hope that I may be able to pull off a victory. This shows position at the end of game turn 9, and we've achieved, or the Romans have achieved, another major victory on the Roman right flank. On the other flank. And the Carthaginian flanks seem to be collapsing. This truly is the opposite of the way historically it occurred. Unfortunately, the Carthaginian flank attack, when I say flank, you'll notice in the centre, the Carthaginian centre unit against the side of one of my units, it doesn't actually negatively impact my unit being hit in the flank in this particular way. The main negative is that there are now 3 units attacking 1, which increases the chance of eliminating it. Incidentally, if you hit opposing edges, then you get some big effects, and that's where flank attacks become quite significant. This is why getting your cavalry in the rear of the enemy is a really nice thing, because then the cavalry, even though it's quite weak and can't really do much against close order infantry, if it happens to hit the rear of a unit which has a friendly unit to its front, you get some major impacts, positive impacts for the attacker anyway. I think there's been sufficient losses now for us to look at the losses, and this is what we've done. Let's determine how close is any side to panicking. This shows all the elements that have been eliminated so far. Based on the rules, the Romans have lost 34 VPs worth of elements, and their panic level is 46. So they have a while to go before panicking, but you know, it's 3/4 of the way there. On the Carthaginian side, they've lost 31 VPs, which means they're definitely winning the game so far. Basically the Carthaginians win the game if the Romans do not win, which means the Romans have to take the objective, and they eliminate more than is eliminated to them. So they're at the present moment in a victory position. Now, in terms of panic, their panic level is 61, so they're nowhere near panicking at the present moment. Now, my feeling is that there would be many more game turns required before any side panics, but the Romans are probably the most susceptible to panicking at the present moment. Okay, let's move on to game turn 10. Even though as a Roman player I have a bit of hope because I've managed to start causing the Carthaginian flanks to crumble, my centre's not looking good, and looking at how close I am to panicking has made me a little bit more nervous. This shows the position at the end of game turn 10. Now, because of the hole in the Roman line, I pulled my cavalry back from my left flank and brought it around to the centre. Otherwise, not much occurred in this game turn, apart from the Carthaginian commander suffering a disorder and losing 1 level. So Hannibal, I'm not quite sure what this actually means when the commander is, the unit gets disrupted and it loses 1 level. Maybe, I don't think it means they're wounded or anything. I don't think it means they're eliminated and someone's replaced them. Maybe it's either they lose confidence, or alternatively, they're spending a lot more of their time trying to shore up the morale of the unit than actually commanding their army. Nonetheless, the system seems to work and achieve a particular objective. Anyway, the Roman commander also has suffered another disorder. Now, both Roman commanders are at level 4. Level 4 is not very good. It means its command radius is effectively 0. It means it can only command the unit that it's attached to. And but it still does have a combat bonus of 3, so it has some value there. Okay, we're moving into game turn 11, and while I still have some hope, I'm getting a little bit... Well, anyway, look, I think this is a very even game at the present moment, surprisingly even. None of the other test games that I played displayed any kind of stalemate in this sort of fashion. So I think basically what's occurring is the Carthaginian player, after observing all the mistakes that I had made, had worked out how to play the Carthaginian army, and that's really the difference in this particular game. This shows position at the end of game turn 11. You'll see the Roman cavalry has moved into melee to support the centre. But again, not much has occurred, apart from the Roman leader suffering yet another disorder and both being removed. So now I effectively have, as the Roman, no leaders, so I have no combat bonus, which is probably the main impact. You know, it's interesting, the command control thing is significant if you're manoeuvring around, but once you're actually engaged in combat, it's probably less significant. On the other hand, these rules really are rules that allow you to fight the battle with both armies a fair distance away from each other, so the manoeuvring is pretty important before the battle, but as I've discovered here, once you're in contact, command control, not so important. However, the combat bonus is very important. So we move on to game turn 12. I'm still not 100% certain who has the upper hand. I suspect the Carthaginians are probably in a winning position, but I still think I have a chance. Okay, what's occurred here is the Carthaginian has suffered yet another disruption. This is a position at the end of game turn 12. And the Carthaginian commander is now dropped to level 3. So Hannibal is, right down to level 3 at the present moment, which has really reduced its combat bonus. The Roman barbarian infantry has moved into melee with the Numidians, who retreat from combat because their speed is greater. But that's okay, that was my expectation. Now we move into game turn 13. Will it be lucky or unlucky for me? I'm not quite sure at the present moment. This shows the position at the end of game turn 13. Now the main thing that's occurred here on the Roman left flank is the barbarian infantry that has pushed the Numidians away has now moved into the flank of the remaining Libyan spearman unit on the Carthaginian right flank, as you can see here. So I'm feeling a little bit confident that I may be able to cause the entire Carthaginian right flank to collapse. So we now move into game turn 14. Once again, I'm feeling a bit confident that I may have turned the tide. This shows the position at the end of game turn 14. The Roman barbarian infantry suffered a disruption from missile troops, and in the melee suffered another disruption, so is eliminated. So my slight glimmer of hope of collapsing the Carthaginian right flank has disappeared. Otherwise, not really much is occurring, each side just bashing away at each other. Let's go and look at the loss situation. Now, in terms of losses, we're still not that close to panic. The Romans are at 42 VPs. They've got a couple, they can still lose several more units before they panic, and the Carthaginians are nowhere near panic. Look, during this game turn, particularly at the end of the game turn, this shows the position. This actually shows the position at an earlier stage. It's more of a general FYI. The game seems to have descended into a stalemate. Now, the only way I can break the stalemate is if one side can achieve a 3-to-1 attack or achieve 2 disruptions. Now, that will break the stalemate. Now, the Romans have one 3-to-1 combat that it can execute, which is on the Roman left flank, which is right of this position. And the Carthaginians have 2 spots here where they could achieve a double disruption. However, in both cases, the probability of doing so is fairly low. Now, there are 5 game turns left, so it's quite possible that one player will manage to spin the necessary die rolls to, possibly break the stalemate. As it turned out, the Carthaginians achieved a double disruption first on its right flank. The Romans, during the same game turn, achieved a half a limb on its left flank. Both these things occurred on game turn 19. The game ends with a Carthaginian victory just. Now, the last 5 game turns only took a few minutes each to play because, they only really consisted of about 4 to 5 die rolls. So the length, the game turn length certainly did not represent an issue. But and this game was extremely close. Now, the reason why it was close is that even though I had managed to basically achieve a half a limb on my left flank, and in theory I could have started moving infantry towards the objective point, the objective was just simply too far away for me to get to. Now, there were some interesting lessons I learned about tactics in this scenario, or at least in this test game. The Romans need to take the objective that you can see on the left on game turn 20 in order to win. I always ensure some of my cavalry was unengaged so could, screen out and get it, such as the 2 elements on the right. Now, unfortunately, I engaged them into melee, so they weren't available, which was possibly an error on my part. However, even if they were available, the movement rate, because I have no command control, would be 5 MPs, and it would take approximately 4 game turns to reach the objective from this position. So I need to do this on game turn 17. However, the Carthaginians still always had their Numidian cavalry free, and these move at 9 MPs and would quickly catch the Roman cavalry and stop them. Look, it was a nice idea I had of lunging out and getting the objective if I could just make a big enough hole, but because the Carthaginians decided to fight as far on the Roman side as possible, which I initially thought was a mistake, I was never close enough to the objective to ever be able to lunge out and catch it near the end of the game. It was just simply never going to occur. So I suspect that was my Carthaginian opponent's strategy. Get the combat occurring, or the main combat occurring, as far away from the objective as possible. So even if the Romans had won, they would still be too far away to get there. Now let's look at my analysis of this game compared with the hex-based game. Look, the game actually plays extraordinarily similar to the hex version. The main difference is that I can much more efficiently use the terrain. Basically, all the units are in base-to-base contact in a line. In my hex version games, I had to normally play along the short axis because I needed the width. In this particular game, when we set up, I realised that playing that way meant that vast amounts of playing area was not required. And if I played along the long axis, I could actually have the Roman objective positioned at its correct position according to the scenario. So, all up, I actually consider this a better way of playing than using hexes. Now, I'm still completing my examples PDF document showing all the possible movements that are allowed, because obviously without hexes, there can be some confusion about what kind of movements are allowed, how can you pivot and things of this nature. I've got a reasonable amount of experience in terms of adding the special rules to allow people to understand how to play without hexes, but example documents are still quite useful. Now, basically, in conclusion, after playing this game, I really don't see any point in using hexes after the experience. I almost certainly would prefer to play this game without hexes. I actually think it's better once you get your head around the movement aspect, the tricky stuff you get with moving into flanks and things of this nature, which incidentally is an issue with all hexless rules. Now let's go back to the game system. Look, I have to admit the game system gives you a good game. There is a reasonable amount of depth, and each game I play allows me to better understand how to use special troop types such as missile troops. For example, however, the way that it achieves this good game can be a bit jarring for someone who uses other figure gaming rules. Choosing any opponent unit adjacent for melee, even if it's through a corner, doesn't quite seem right to me, but it does work, and any change will almost certainly cause issues, as I've tried to play around with this rule in some of my solo playtesting games. The rules are, suitable for a competition game, and reproducing historical battles. But I suspect their real sweet spot is reproducing historical battles rather than a points-based competition game such as with DBMM. If you're going to use these rules for a comp, I would suspect the best way to do so is to pick a scenario and comp that, not use a points-based game. In terms of game length, pretty much similar to my previous game. A game length seems to be from 90 minutes to 120 minutes, not including setup time. This would allow a player to easily have 2 games in a day, or possibly even 3 at a stretch. One other advantage I found is that, my scenario, the objective point was a fair distance behind the front line. I suspect if the scenario, like if I played the marathon scenario where there's not so much depth, the optimal playing area size would probably be 3 feet wide by 2 feet deep, which allow both players to basically sit at a table and look at each other. I think a lot of battles you could probably achieve in this way without hexes. With hexes, I found I need a bigger playing area, but without hexes, because of the economy, I can probably reproduce most historical battles by, basically having a single width table, maybe 80 centimetres wide, with a playing area and 2 players basically seated for the entire game, looking at each other, playing the game. And I consider this a big, big plus. Now, in terms of the negative, I suspect after a few games of a specific scenario, players would get bored. But as there are 60 scenarios, I don't think this is a real major issue. The same can be said for another kind of set of rules similar to this, such as Lost Battle. And this is one of the downsides of having a simple game system. Once you learn how to win a game, or not to, how not to lose a game, most of the games start looking very similar to each other. The only variability tends to be luck, and that's not a great variability. However, really in ultimate conclusion, the game flow was very good. Once you know the rules, you only need to reference the CRT, and I have a cheat sheet which includes everything on one double-sided sheet. I pretty much, apart from the commander disruption rules, I never had to refer to the actual original rules. And, after you've played a few games, I'll never forget the commander disruption rule again. So I suspect that any future games I play, I just simply won't need to reference the rules at all. I'll just have a cheat sheet, double-sided, and that's all I'll ever possibly need to reference. These are a very good introductory set of rules, particularly for new players, but they are very abstract, so a perfectionist will find aspects of the game system annoying, particularly its simplicity with combat. Now, as with all the rules that I've done, all my conversions, I have a hexless version of these rules. These will be on my group.io Kriegspiel site. I'm cleaning them up at the present moment, and as I discover any issues, I'll continue to do editing. But the rules are basically identical to the original, with only the removal of hexes, being the change. So it's possible to not even use this PDF in order for you to play a game. You can simply download the original SPI rules, and the basic ideas that I've just mentioned to you, you could probably play a game. My next project is to add DBMM troop types and to rework the scenarios to use these troop types. If the scenarios work then, with these, I can then use these rules as an introduction to DBMM. Players can use a DBMM-based force mix and the DBMM army list with these rules. Once they've played the rules out, they can move to DBMM. At least that's my plan, and they'll have some level of familiarity. So, look, when you're learning a complex set of rules, if you can somehow learn as many elements of it backwards, like army lists, the way allies work, the way deployments, etc., when you actually get to learning DBMM, you can actually only focus on the game system for play instead of worrying about all these other things. The most difficult things about learning a new set of rules is you're sitting there, you're saying, oh, what happens now? And it can be something really simple, like, how do I deploy this? How does my terrain go here? What are the restrictions with allied armies? How do I even build an army using the army list? If I can basically get people familiar with as much of this sort of surrounding stuff with DBMM, when they actually learn the rules, they can just focus on the core game system in order to help them to learn the rules. Anyway, that's my plan. I'm not sure if it'll work. Many of my brilliant ideas have failed miserably. I'm hoping this one is not one of them. And so we come to a close of my part 5 of my pre-17th century war game rules. In this case, an example of the Cannae scenario without hexes. All the materials are on my Group.io Kriegsspiel site. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.